So we're here to talk about how to move forward the massive and really encouraging swell of grassroots action that we've seen this year after the Democratic Party demonstrated its corrupt nature with backroom dealings proven by the recent WikiLeaks revelations prohibiting Sanders from being the nominee. I'd like to start by quoting the person who helped renew all this activity, Bernie Sanders. He said, quote, "A campaign has got to be much more than just getting votes and getting elected. It's got to be helping educate people, helping organize people. If we can do that, we can change the dynamic of politics for years and years to come. We can elect the best person in the world to be president, but that person will get swallowed up unless there's an unprecedented level of activism at the grassroots level." So Senator Sanders and I agree wholeheartedly here, and I think a launching point of agreement is really important. That said, I think it's obvious that many of the people involved in the Sanders campaign have a desire to continue even after he has endorsed Hillary Clinton, which begs the question, how are we going to do that? What's the best way to continue that political revolution? Today I'd like to make the case that the structure of the Democratic Party is specifically designed to disempower its members, and that any strategy which places the Democratic Party structure over a grassroots movement is doomed to fail. To understand how this structure developed and why a different tactic is necessary for change, we have to look at the history of the Democratic Party. I'd like to start with the New Deal, since that's when the tactics of trying to pull the Democrats from the left from within really got traction, and it's what we typically think of when we think of the Democrats in the good guy role. It's important to have a bit of background here to contextualize FDR's social programs as they were. Not a proactive attempt to make life better for the working class, but a desperate attempt to appease the growing movement that was terrifying the ruling class. In the years previous to FDR's election, the labor movement had been gaining serious traction. Strikes and unionization were on the rise, and so was class consciousness. The massive failure of Hoover to address the Depression left a full 25% of all people in the U.S. unemployed. That's 15 million people, with many more homeless and unable to afford food. The response to this was guided largely by independent movements. There was no real political outlet for the unemployed, particularly if they were black or brown, and shantytowns had begun to be constructed all over the U.S., known as Hoovervilles. In these communities, there was organization and activity, oftentimes led by the most marginalized people in that society. Unemployment councils began to spring up all over, even outside of Hoovervilles, with hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets of New York City, Detroit, Washington, San Francisco, and other cities in mass protests against the unemployment, while select individuals were living in extreme luxury. This was all alongside starving mobs taking food from food trucks carrying baked goods, marches on stores to demand food from the storekeepers, and eviction resistances, armed eviction resistances. It's important to note that these unemployment councils embraced diversity of race and gender, which was part of their successful growth, and that this terrified the ruling class. Black men like Sam Nesson and Solomon Harper were beaten, charged with inciting riots, and thrown into prison or hospitalized to stop them from organizing. At the same time, all major municipalities around the U.S. began to go bankrupt. They also began demanding relief from the government alongside the unemployed labor force. By June of 1932, the mayor of Chicago told a House committee that if the federal government didn't send $150 million for relief now, they'd have to send troops for relief later. The Democratic Party was quick to tail these uprisings, claiming to be part of the action versus Republican inaction. At first, the success of this strategy was due to the visceral reaction and rejection of Hoover, voting the incumbent Republicans out, a two-party system response before becoming more entrenched. This was all alongside a series of strikes by the employed, culminating in an electrified political atmosphere that was largely being driven by folks who had previously been disenfranchised. So when FDR was inaugurated, he immediately proposed and Congress passed measures to address the level of unemployment, but more importantly, to address the level of struggle. He passed the NRA, which formalized the right to unionize, but also gave businesses the right to fix prices. It was colloquially referred to by black people at the time as the Negro Removal Act, or the Negro Robbed Again, because it excluded racial minorities from minimum wage laws, occupational safety regulations, and other provisions. The New Deal established things like the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put more men to work back in national forests and public works. It provided work for 2.5 million people over the next 10 years. But women were legally barred from the CCC because construction wasn't considered appropriate women's work, and quotas limited black people to just 10% of the jobs. And those 10% were segregated and were required to live in non-permanent housing. Eligibility for job programs were similarly segregated, as historian Nancy Rose points out when she says, quote, In general, the eligibility test was applied most leniently in large northern cities where protest was more widespread, as the levels of underemployment led people to understand that joblessness was not caused by personal failure, but by factors beyond the control of individuals. It was applied most stringently in the rural areas of the South, where the white elites continued to fight against attempts to provide relief, especially to African Americans, because it provided an alternative to ultra-low wage labor. So all this resulted in a schism in this growing labor movement, as white male workers were given a legitimate way to survive, while others were left to be reliant on them in the form of either dependency or service employment that hinged on their patronage. While this was going on, it was accompanied by a push in the party structure to remove the unemployed, now largely segregated by gender and race, away from tactics that would disrupt society. Specifically, they condemned the very tactics that had been successful in getting actual change. The unemployment councils were barred from the relief centers that these programs took place in, and the leadership pushed the ideology of lesser evilism to the former members of the movement. If you don't work with us, you'll have to work against the Republicans. This was alongside a legislative effort to move the relief programs available to all and replace them with programs that provided manual labor for just above poverty wages to anyone but white men. In 1934, FDR said, quote, "Continued dependence on relief induces a spiritual disintegration fundamentally destructive to the national fiber," to give you an idea how those horrible policies were justified. The demobilization of the unemployment movement gave control of the political power that had been seized by the workers to the upper echelon of the Democratic Party, the very wealthy elite they had taken it from in the first place. The UAW, the CIO, and others considered splitting with the Democrats for a labor party at this point, probably the most significant attempt for a third party in our nation's history. They specifically were going to set it up to represent the interests of the working class of labor. Several unions actually voted not to support FDR or the Democrats, but were blackmailed by John Lewis, an AFL bureaucrat, to fall back into line. Sidney Hillman, another AFL bureaucrat, said, quote, "I say to you that the defeat of Roosevelt and the introduction of a real fascist movement is going to make the work of building a real labor movement impossible." A line which echoes to this very day, where we're told if we don't vote for a Democrat, we'll be the victim of a new fascist movement led by Trump and his supporters. In the decades that followed, many strikes and labor actions would be put down, often violently, often by the state, and most often under a Democrat. When the labor movement sufficiently quelled this strategy, its relevance dropped when the labor movement was sufficiently quelled by this strategy, its relevance dropped severely. The real challenge now to the establishment was opposition to the war, which was necessary as the labor movement's gains had limited the profitability of domestic production, and the Soviets presented a threat that the establishment obsessed over. The anti-war movement began to grow in a very similar way to the labor movement, protests and demonstrations filling city streets and grinding society to a halt. Lyndon B. Johnson ran in 1964 under a platform of peace. During his campaign, he stated with regards to Vietnam, quote, "We're not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." He, immediately invaded Vietnam. So, his Republican opponent, Barry Goldwater, was thought of by many as a warmonger. He referred to the USSR as the enemy, and many suspected he would use nuclear arms against the Soviet Union, or perhaps worse, invade Vietnam. Despite his campaign, when elected, LBJ escalated the war in Vietnam. He requested that he be allowed to increase U.S. military presence before the election even finished in 1964 to appear tougher to the electorate. The U.S. military supported the ongoing Vietnamese raids in the countryside and implemented a U.S. program of bombing the Lao border to disrupt supply lines, as well as backing the South Vietnamese raids of the North Vietnamese coast and stationing, as well as stationing 2 destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. This was followed by yet another U.S.-led bombing campaign and then a deployment of troops in '67. The next year begins the pattern of Democrats using primaries to rally a movement and then refocus it on electing someone who doesn't share the values that rallied the movement. George McGovern was a figure of opposition to the Vietnam War, and when it was clear he wouldn't win the 1968 primary, he backed Humphrey, disillusioning many in the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement took a cue from its labor predecessor and began to trail these Democratic politicians claiming to oppose the war. Rather than lending strength to the anti-war movement, this functioned to undercut it and move support away from anti-war activism to anti-deployment activism, ignoring the military imperialism being conducted by the U.S., such as coups in Guatemala, Chile, Iran, and others indirectly. We can see the remnants of this as Obama campaigned on a platform of peace, drawing in swiftly growing opposition to U.S. imperialism, closing Guantanamo, ending the war in Iraq, and various vague suggestions of easing U.S. intervention. Drew in groups that had previously been focused on demonstrations and activism to electoral politics and away from direct action. The result of this strategy are similar to what it has been in the past. An escalation in Afghanistan, Guantanamo still open, thousands of troops still in Iraq, increased military presence in Pakistan, Libya, Yemen, Syria, a drone campaign known worldwide for its civilian casualties. One could talk about other issues he co-opted movements around and failed to gain real traction on, not the least of which is immigration reform, which he promised while overseeing record deportations. But since we've got a limited amount of time, I'm going to move on to the civil rights movement and its relationship to the Democratic Party. By 54, when segregation was struck down legally but still enforced by states, conditions were again ripe for protest, and similar to how the labor movement and anti-war movement gained traction, the Montgomery bus boycott, inspired by Rosa Parks among others, was among the first and brought prominence to activists like Martin Luther King Jr. Virtually every former Confederate state enacted legislative policies to prevent desegregation, including closing and padlocking schools rather than opening them to people of color. During this period, we see strange and sometimes drastic shifts in the policies of both parties in order to court both the Southern racist vote and the Northern black and leftist vote. LBJ, for instance, was consistent during his time in the House of Representatives in voting against 100% of the legislation that challenged segregation and voting for, repeatedly, legislation that further entrenched segregation. The Republicans courted the black vote, and in 1956, for the first time since the New Deal, a Republican, Eisenhower, received the majority of the black vote. Consequently, LBJ began to shift his positions accordingly, proposing the Civil Rights Act of 1957. It's worth noting he, as soon as it got out of committee, gutted it to appease his Dixiecrat base because he was the Senate Majority Leader at the time. So it was the civil rights movement in the 1960s that really began actual change, not just lip service. Sit-ins and other forms of protest began to spread like wildfire. The Southern Christian Leadership Council had formed in the wake of the success of the Montgomery boycott, and they focused on civil disobedience in order to obtain the right to vote. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was also formed, but it had a much more broad purview going on to help found the Black Power movement. Once again, direct action shifted the political landscape, and Democrats were pulled to the left by an outside grassroots movement. Kennedy saw an opportunity and took it by calling Coretta Scott King while her husband was in prison and calling for his release. The Democrats distributed 2 million copies of brochures condemning Republican inaction and exalting the Kennedy's actions during this in racial ghettos. Kennedy received 82% of the black vote in the 1960s, but then immediately proceeded to ignore the infringement of black people's rights. Instead of fighting for civil liberties as he promised, he appointed 3 overtly racist white supremacists to the Supreme Court. Because his rhetoric was strong in the area, but his action was lacking, both the Southern racists and the civil rights movement were dissatisfied and began to escalate their tactics. Freedom rides in the case of the civil rights movement, violent suppression in the case of the reactionaries. These tactics gave the movement national attention and brought the cruelty and inhumanity of white supremacy to the forefront of the media's attention. Kennedy could no longer ignore it. His solutions, however, were very traditional for the Democrats, focused on removing the threat to the status quo represented by the effective civil rights movement, rather than changing the conditions of black people that gave rise to that movement. Specifically, by funneling all activity into limited reforms that only addressed voting rights, he drew them away from the strategies that had been so successful. He told the representatives of student groups, if you cut out all this freedom riding and sitting in stuff, I'll give you a tax exemption. Southern states responded to this strategy, black people being sent to the South to register their black voters with unrelenting violence. In the words of an assistant of Kennedy's, yet a year afterwards, there were multiple beatings, murders, and arrests, but no new black voters in the South. Despite extensive documentation of violence against the activists he had begged to go, no action was taken by the Kennedy administration to support them once they went, leaving the activists to face the violence without federal support. So during the course of the campaign for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, over 20 churches were bombed and Kennedy himself was assassinated. After the Battle of Birmingham, LBJ called for the bill's passing despite a 54-day filibuster from Southern forces, and swiftly followed it with the Voting Rights Act a year later. In the wake of this, the voting rights movement in the South ebbed, and the North refocused on economic issues. With the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Democrats entrenched themselves as a party for black people in the South, which took part of the movement from the streets towards party building for the Democrats. The incentives of public office were compelling to the conservative wing of the movement, leading them to turn away from protest and even denounce it. The group was further entrenched by the Great Society and the War on Poverty programs enacted by LBJ, which mirrored FDR's tactic of providing relief to select groups of people to divide and disempower the whole movement. The left wing of the movement now faced a question. What did voting rights matter if jobs weren't available for black people, or if the wages were so low as to keep the worker in a perpetual state of poverty? The problem was underscored and exemplified by a series of riots in 66 and 67. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense formed in order to address the issue in communities and provide relief. Again, like in the 1930s, a workers' movement formed and was making amazing gains when LBJ responded with the Great Society/War on Poverty programs. These measures were focused around creating a moderate layer of working class people, this time including some black men, to pose an alternative to the leftist aid programs of the Panthers and others like them. A decade later, Jesse Jackson would try to steer the party from the left from within. Like McGovern before him, Jackson acted as a magnet for liberal voters dissatisfied with the current platform of the Democrats with his National Rainbow Coalition campaigns in 1984 and 1988. In 84, he won around 21% of the vote in the Democratic primary, but the rules restricted him to only 11% of the delegates. He ended up endorsing Walter Mondale without winning any concessions to his platform. Mondale dismissed the coalition out of hand, but still received their support. The same was true of Dukakis in 1988. In the words of Jesse Jackson, quote, "We have too much invested in the Democratic Party. When you have money in the bank, you just don't walk away from it." It's another attempt to pull the Democrats to the left from within, failed by co-optation. And what's interesting here, I'm not sure if you folks have seen it, there's a video going around Facebook of Bernie Sanders responding to this at the time. And he is very, very eloquent about why he does not support a rainbow coalition from within the Democratic Party, but would support that exact same formation outside of the Democratic Party. And I think it's worth taking a listen to. The women's rights movement, too, was subverted. Mass strikes by women, growing social and political power, and organizations that included women from multiracial backgrounds working together grew in the movement for suffrage, though like any movement existing within a society built on and around white supremacy, there was also a lot of racism. Elma Green points out, quote, "Suffrage rhetoric claimed that enfranchised women would outlaw child labor, pass minimum wage and maximum wage laws for women workers, and establish health and safety standards for factory workers." My goodness. Once white women gained suffrage in the U.S., these multiracial groups with these radical demands were quickly cast aside by the newly co-opted Democratic Party. More recently, the Occupy movement faced the typical response from the Democrats. They co-opted what they could in terms of language and some policy, and brutally suppressed or entirely ignored what they couldn't co-opt. The Black Lives Matter movement has also been gaining traction and has faced violent Democratic assault in Ferguson and opportunistic co-optation by people like Hillary Clinton. The Sanders campaign recognizes the need for a mass movement, but it does not seem to acknowledge what the Democratic Party does to such movements. So that's not an attempt to be antagonistic, but that's really the only way I can describe Sanders' strategy given what he has stated in the past. I understand that he agrees with my description of the Democratic Party and how it works, but that's mostly because what he has said in the past and said often. So here are just some quotes by Bernie Sanders that I'd like to close on before Cliff continues. So he said, quote, "We have to ask ourselves, why should we work within the Democratic Party if we don't agree with anything the Democratic Party says? My own feeling is that the Democratic Party is ideologically bankrupt. They have no ideology. Their ideology is opportunism." And my personal favorite quote by Sanders, "You just don't change the system from within the Democratic Party." So, in case you might think these are too old to be applicable, here's Sanders in 2014. "In real terms, what the Democratic campaign program is about is, we're bad, but they're worse, so vote for us." And that's true. We're pretty bad, but the Republicans are worse, and that's the reason you should vote for the Democrats. He also said, this is before his campaign, "I am not a Democrat because the Democratic Party does not represent and has not for many years the interest of working class families, middle class people, and low income people." So given that Sanders understands all too well the role of the Democratic Party, how it functions, and how it acts as an inhibitor of progress, we should all be extremely wary of a pivot towards the Democratic Party. So I do believe that right now, as the political revolution continues, there's a choice that we face, which is to continue working inside of the Democratic Party for Democratic Party politicians in Democratic primaries, or to create the sort of grassroots, top, bottom-up movement that that has affected change in the past. So, with that, I'd like to let Cliff pick it up from there. Okay.
Thank you, John. Should I introduce you a little?
Go right ahead.
Sorry, this is a little informal, as is this whole thing.
A man who needs no introduction.
Cliff Wilming is an experienced labor organizer, and I like to think of you as a fighter, based on what I know and I've seen of you. He's a socialist. He's not a member of the ISO. Too much to
Socialist at large, I would say.
Socialist at large. Okay. I know you're a veteran of the Battle of Seattle, which, thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. And a lot of fights in Chicago, labor fights, anti-KKK fights. And more recently, he's been involved in the Colorado Community Rights Network, which has been fighting fracking and environmental predation in this state, particularly in the town that he's from, Lafayette. And he's had some great successes against them, which I don't know if you want to talk about, but I can't speak to them the way you can. And then you also ran as a Green Party member for Congress briefly this year.
That's true.
And so, I think you're searching for a way to like a lot of us, to kind of find a hole in their armor, so to speak. So thanks Cliff for being here.
Thanks. Thanks to the ISO for having everyone here today. Every time I come to one of these, I usually leave saying I need to go to a lot more of those things because I don't think that personally I'm taking a whole lot of time to sit down and break some things apart and do some real analysis about where the hell we actually are and where we actually need to go. Yes, and Jason brought it up. Some of my greatest victories were coming in last place as a Lafayette City Council candidate, running on a socialist platform, and then dropping out of the Congressional District 2 race. So those are my main bit of authority walking into this conversation. In any case, I should say that, I work for the Colorado Community Rights Network, which does, it's in essence a very radical legal approach to deconstructing the system. So, it deals with everything from fracking to why local communities cannot enact a local living wage, why is it that we can't bring police to justice, all that sort of thing. And then more recently, the Green Party. I should say that I'm not here as an agent of either one of those organizations, and so all the ideas that I am putting out here today are my own. Those organizations can distance themselves from me after the conversation. It's an interesting point in history that we are in. I would have to say that in about 30 years of activism, I've never experienced anything quite like it. And it's also interesting when you are entrusted to do a leadoff or a presentation of where do we go from here, because we've essentially been asking ourselves that for about 100 fucking years. So it's no small task. So basically, the long and the short of what I wanted to get into today comes down to two basic points. What is a movement, and elections, and what is a mass party? Those two topics are really, I think, the fulcrums of where we need to kind of address ourselves, or at least start the conversation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what a movement is. So, it's interesting to me today because I know that if I get on Facebook, not that I ever do, you can find a movement being described in any possible terms. If I sign an online petition asking Governor Hickenlooper to regulate fracking better, I'm part of the anti-fracking movement. If I write a letter to my congressman talking about that the police should be more curtailed in their violence or their racism against people, I'm part of the anti-police violence movement. And movement is used very flippantly these days. The same can be said about the term revolution. Everything's a damn revolution today. So we've had so many revolutions that I don't even know what they're actually talking about anymore. So that's both in kind of like trajectory as well as what they're actually addressing as well as strategies. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of your cardboard box or your maybe your Amazon level activism. This would be the activism that is delivered to your front door, what we are expected to engage in. There's a few assumptions that go along with people that start to come into activity for their first time. The first assumption is a very big one and is very important. The first assumption is that the system is inherently fair. And that, of course, it errs from this fair mission and sometimes makes mistakes, but the long and the short trajectory of it is that the system can be appealed to and it can be pressured, and then the system will naturally make those corrections based on that kind of pressure. So yes, that goes, from your 5th grade history book saying that we actually live in a democracy, and the intent of this narrative is to get you to buy into the idea that the system cannot be broken. It is actually functioning, and so then you have to, of course, ingratiate yourself to it in some way. There's a second part of this narrative too, which is that social change usually comes through the acts of heroic people, ideally white men. So I just want to do like a little example because I think that we're all in like kind of a common consciousness with this. So just based on your life experience, or at least what the textbooks told you, who was it that ended slavery?
Abraham Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln, thank you very much. Who gave us the New Deal?
FDR.
FDR, thank you, you're doing very well. Who signed the Civil Rights Act? Johnson, all right? So we had 3 white capitalist males that did all of those great things for us, and that's how we're supposed to view that. So the prescribed conclusion here is, and we can't really get into the Civil War because the term war is associated with that, and that change took a little bit more than an online petition. But the by and large is that the system is inherently fair but needs guidance and direction. Alongside of this narrative is an equally important narrative. It's the idea that if you commit this level of activism and you appeal to the system and the system does not change, it's our fault. All right? We didn't bring the right podium. We didn't get enough signatures on the petition. We didn't have like the most articulate press statement. There weren't enough people at the demonstration, and so we get to internalize the blame of any failure of the system, and the system gets to take all credit for it. In addition to that, our activism will encounter mechanisms of dissent. And you can bet that anytime you get involved with any kind of topic, you will be very encouraged to employ yourself into these various mechanisms or institutions. So let's do another quiz. Jonathan, you're out of this one because you won the last round. So if you're fighting police violence, what is the institution that the police tell you to go to address your concerns? Does anybody know?
Our friendly district attorney.
Friendly district attorney. Where I come from, it's the Internal Review Board, which means the police reviewing themselves. How about if the oil and gas industry wants to blow your community up with a bunch of oil rigs, who do you go to?
Colorado Oil and Gas Association.
Colorado Oil and Gas Association, Environmental Protection Agency, right? There's a lot of them. Here's another. How many people here are in a union besides myself? Oh.
I used to be.
Don't be shy. We all used to be.
I'm retired.
So how about if your employer isn't treating you fairly, you've got some kind of discrimination on the job site. Do you know who you go to for that?
Human Resources.
Human Resources is the ideal one because that's just management.
Right.
But outside of that, the government has given us the National Labor Relations Board to address those concerns. All of these institutions have a few things in common. One, they were formed by the government during times of massive social and civil unrest. As Jonathan very clearly pointed out, the National Labor Relations Board was formed during the 1930s. In 1934 alone, there was 3 general strikes. The EPA, of course, was founded right after the civil rights movement and after the anti-war movement, when people were moving much more clearly into direct physical resistance and direct action. And so Nixon, as we know him to be a very deep and profound progressive, gave us the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as like the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. And of course, these were supposed to fix the environment. I hope no one here believes that they actually did. Expanding from this, basically what we have is we have this narrative that the system is fair, that the system can be appealed to, that there's vehicles that we need to channel our dissent into, and that is kind of the cookie cutter model of activism. Contrast that to what is a movement. And I put together a very poorly worded definition of a movement, so you guys can pick it apart if you like. But I'm saying is, a movement is the independent political force and strategy that is formed when a mass of organized people conclude that the system is functioning against them and their interests by design, and consciously organized to break the laws that constrain them. Okay? This can take all kinds of forms. It can take on an individual form. Rosa Parks was an individual action that was supported by a movement. It can mean 4 people blockading themselves against police violence and racism. It can mean urban unrest or giant, what we would be told are riots, all the way up to general strikes, which I don't think anyone in this room has ever experienced. 2 components to this that are somewhat ubiquitous throughout movements. Civil disobedience, which is the conscientious attempt or intent to break the law so that the inherent contradictions of the system are forced up into the light of day. I certainly did not create that definition. That's really Martin Luther King, who wrote that from a letter from Birmingham jail when he was essentially being attacked by the liberal class of the white liberals as well as the black clergy about his use of civil disobedience. They said that he was causing trouble, and what he was saying is that no, the civil disobedience that they were involved in is actually exposing the inherent trouble that is already exists and buried. And then as well as direct action, which is the direct interference of the mechanisms of the system itself. All movements embrace some or all of all movements embrace some of these, and all movements embrace this one particular idea, that is the system is fixed and it is our job to break it. All movements break the laws, every single one of them, whether it's the abolitionist movement, the women's suffragist movement, civil rights, the labor movement, it really doesn't matter, it's common. Couple other understandings about a movement is that power comes from below. That the emphasis of any movement is not to get somebody up into office to fight in place of us, but the movement is to build the power and the structure and the organizational capacity of the grassroots on up. So that's a bit about movements. I'm going to move a little fast here just because, you know, when we're looking off into the next 100 years, there's a lot of material to cover. I want to talk a little bit about elections and the mass party. Jason did a little bit of an introduction to myself. I should say that in all my years, and I said that I've effectively lost 2 elections now in the last 1 year. 99.9% of my political history has been found me in an antagonistic position to electoral politics. I've really only started to embrace them through ballot initiatives and running our own candidates in the last year. And I think that pretty much goes for the left in general. There's a standard view of elections that we're all told to embrace, just like we're told to conceptualize activism and movement building. One is that we live in a democratic republic, of course. So this is the idea that we elect people to go and they make social change on our behalf, if we're lucky. And that we are able to choose who gets into office to represent us. That's our freedom. And then alongside of that, and please be very careful whenever you hear this term, that we get to hold their feet to the fire. Because at that moment, you are being set up to be completely unimportant politically. How many people here have ever heard of the Princeton study that came out in the last couple of years that talked about congressional decisions and who they reflect? So this is really wicked because Princeton, a notable university of the working class, I'm being facetious, came out with a study that basically showed what it did was it looked at the decisions of the United States Congress and transposed them on the demands or the ideas or the desires of the lowest 99% of the economic bracket as opposed to the 1%. And what Princeton found is that regardless of the amount of lobbying that we do, the decisions of the Congress always represent the demands of the 1%. There is an exclusion to this where the Congress will actually make decisions that represent the 99%, but it is in those rare moments that the 99% and the 1% happen to agree on something. That's how the Congress works. In addition to that, the idea of voting, and I want to talk a little bit about this, where you take your problems to the ballot box. We certainly did that in Lafayette. Many folks across Colorado did that in 2013. I come from one of these communities that, in Lafayette, we created the largest ban on fossil fuel use or extraction in Colorado history. We did that through a ballot initiative that also banned all associated industrial, banned all infrastructure for fossil fuel extraction, and also banned the disposal of fossil fuels in Lafayette with all criminal penalties. We won that by a vote of 60% of the Lafayette people. We kicked ass. We beat the Colorado Oil and Gas Association with that. Within 1 month, we were sued by the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, and within 1 year, the entire measure was found to be illegal, patently illegal by the Colorado District Court, and they told us that the law could not be enforced. Now, whether we want to enforce that law ourselves is, of course, a different matter. But that's essentially how this stuff works, is that we are backed into a paradigm of completely useless and non-threatening activism. So there's that. So in addition to this, there's a standard view from the left about elections, and I can recite that from a personal experience. For one, and there is some truth to all of this, that they're engineered to draw our time, labor, and money into a system with predetermined outcomes that don't favor us, that our power comes from defiance, mobilizations, and demonstrations, which I think many of us agree with, and that even if we get somebody elected, they're just going to be co-opted. Look at the example of Barack Obama, such a popular guy, now fighting for Wall Street, just signed the Monsanto Dark Act. Who could have seen it coming? And so by and large, the left has avoided elections altogether. And I think that on a whole, is a mistake, even if the intents were healthy. I learned a little bit about this when I was organizing as a rank-and-file carpenter in the Carpenters Union of Chicago. To make a very long and sometimes violent story short, we were a group of rank-and-file carpenters that placed demands on the union and the contractors. We wanted to retire earlier. We wanted better benefits. We wanted equal inclusion of all genders and races in the decision-making bodies of the unions. And we were really good on the job site. We got out there, we had petitions, we organized our coworkers, and we had our own independent meetings. We set up shadow organizations for every single carpenter local around the entire district council. These were all outside of the Carpenters Union. The main group of people that opposed us were the union leaders themselves. They were the ones that were most threatened in their relationship to the contractors by the peasants, or what you will, making these kind of demands on the wealthy contractors, and they were the first ones to oppose us. They organized violent oppositions to us. We could not even get into our union hall without coming up with about 20, 25 people. Lots of fist fights, bottles, bats, that kind of stuff that you would associate with Chicago union activity. At one point, at that point, I would have probably called myself an anarchist, which meant that I felt that the real power needed to come on the job site and our ability to shut the job site down. The carpenters I was working with, which lined up mainly Democrat, but there were a few hardcore right-wingers as well that happened to be militant trade unionists. So they kind of embodied that really nice contradiction. What they said is, well, if all the problems are coming from the local cliff, we have to take over the local because they're using the local and the resources of that local to stop us from getting what we need. I argued with them and said, no, we should maintain our activism on the job sites, but we shouldn't get caught up in the trying to do the electoral politics of taking over the carpenters local. And what they basically said in workers' shorthand was that I could go fuck myself. and that if I wasn't ready to actually take power, that I wasn't a serious human being to begin with. And that gave me cause to reflect. And after a few short weeks, I agreed that they were absolutely right. And that is really what changed me from being an anarchist to a socialist, to a Marxist. It was no book. It was a bunch of Democratic Party members that happened to share a Carpenters Union card with me, and the implied political threat of total irrelevance. So that's what we did, and we ran for office. That was essentially a transformative moment for me, because what it basically showed me is that we could do both. That we could build power on the work site, that we could get out and do the grassroots organizing, but on the other side of that, that as long as there was the local that was wielding power over us, we were going to be somewhat effective, and that we needed to take that damn power. We needed to stop appealing to it. We needed to appropriate it. And I would say that the Carpenters Union, even though it's a union, there are parallels to the government or to what we consider the state today. I've been watching the Democratic conference for the last week, which was both thrilling and aggravating. I think that we've all seen it. It was wonderfully discordant, I think. I have to give the Bernie folks some major credit. Staging those walkouts, continuing to go back in, continuing to live stream from the place. What was very clear was when Bernie Sanders kept telling people they had to vote for Clinton, everybody booed. And so what he ended up doing, because he's a clever guy and he knew what he was doing, he started to say this campaign, which means that you don't know whether he's talking about his campaign against the billionaire class or the new campaign of the billionaire class. So it was somewhat confusing to me, but I thought it was actually quite clever. And the more important thing, of course, isn't the talking points of Bernie Sanders, but the fact that the rank and file were now, he was losing control of the rank and file, and he had to start making adjustments on the fly so that the opposition did not really solidify and become too strong in that moment. I think that growing out of this entire last year, I think that what we're hearing is a call for a party of the 99%. Which to me is like a clear bell. It's something that I have not heard in a very long time. It's very refreshing, and I'll go into that a little bit. I've got maybe about 5 or 10 minutes more material here, and then we can kind of wrap it up for discussion. When we talk about the party, the 99%, it's different than saying a third party, because the Libertarians are a third party. Ross Perot was a third party. The party of the 99% takes a class line. It means the 1% aren't invited, which I think is very helpful, and I'll explain why. I believe it's a political necessity. I believe that any party that forms that does not take some type of class line will inherently bring all of the conflict and contradictions of class society within the party, where they will manifest themselves and rend the party. I believe that's what will take place. I'm a member of the Green Party. I think that the Green Party experiences that to some extent. I'll go into that a little bit more in a few. I want to explain very quickly what I mean when I say the 99%, or often I'll say the working class, because there's always confusion with this stuff. And then we get into this wicked conversation about whether a single or a self-employed person is working class, but if they're self-employed, and we don't want to get into that today. We can do that some other time. I would say that the working class, of course, are all union members. I would exclude the police from that definition, even though they do hold union cards. We could talk about that a little bit more. The unemployed, the entire prison population, all immigrant labor, and all labor that is productive of value across the entire planet. It is not confined to the United States. It does not obey borders. And of course, we can get into the details of that. And I usually, when I do these presentations in a socialist setting, I try to avoid even quoting any socialists, but sometimes you're just forced to, because there were some very good ones. Frederick Engels, one of the co-authors of the Communist Manifesto, talked about this type of moment in US politics. What Engels actually said was, the task for the American working class, primarily, when entering the movement, is to create a party for, by, and of the working class, where the working class will share a common identity, that it will hear its own voice, that it will sense its own power, that it will start making connections within itself, so that it can identify a political vehicle and structure and create the political force for itself as a class. Secondary to that, he said that that party would eventually, due to its composition, become a socialist party at some point. But the emphasis, which I think is very important for this stage, is that it be a party of the working class. Drawing from our discussion on movements, I think that the Mass Party would be a common organization to integrate movements into a common and living political force. It could combine our own candidates, its own legal strategy, calls to mass action. It could build its own media and communications. It could connect the issues and build a systemic and independent analysis to the two capitalist parties. It could start to call general strikes, and it could start to build these ideas internationally so that it was not confined just to the United States. Obviously, there are some obstacles to this, otherwise the group would be much bigger at this point. The two-party system itself, you're all feeling it right now because they're nervous about their control. You're with her, whether you like it or not. What we call in the environmental movement, in the community rights movement, I should say, the not-for-profit industrial complex. How many people have ever heard that term? I think it's wonderful. But this is essentially, these are professionally highly funded groups that have paid staff that help us see our activism in terms of lobbying and ingratiating ourselves to the existing power structure. They do good work. I know that there's extremely genuine people in them, but the larger role of those organizations, the not-for-profits, are to continue to keep us very constrained. Environmentalism, we see this all the time. The Sierra Club has just endorsed the fracking cheerleader, Hillary Clinton. We see this in the union leadership as well, where they just endorse the same person. How many people here know D-Ray from Black Lives Matter, who is now having meetings at his home? He ran for Baltimore mayor on the Democratic ticket, and he's now meeting with fundraisers from all of the top financial institutions of Wall Street to fund his campaign. This is the way the system views us. This is the way they tend to take our leaders and bring them into controlled scenarios of opposition. The union leadership, if you've never experienced them, I will say they are among the worst. They are not pacifists, and they are essentially the proxy of the Democratic Party that has taken over the organizational structures of the big worker organizations. On top of that, I'm going to piss everybody here off at this point. On top of that, I'll say the left itself on two counts. One is essentially sectarianism, which means it is the placing of the needs of your own organization higher than the needs of the movement. That took me a little while to kind of integrate into my thoughts, but there is competing. I mean, anyone here that has been in the socialist left for a significant portion of time can rattle off the name of 100 different Marxist groups that do not work together. Or if they do, it can tend to be a shit show. So there's that. There's also the concept of ultra-leftism too, which is very pleasing. I can speak from a personal perspective, but basically what ultra-leftism is, it's conducting your political activity without concerning yourself about integrating it or connecting with the consciousness of people. So anybody here can say smash the state, and the state doesn't really give a damn. That is a very good, although gross, example of ultra-leftism. Feels good, but it's not necessarily effective. In addition to the obstacles of creating a mass party, I would say the current state of the working class. I have often said that the working class, as of today, cannot find its ass with two hands and a flashlight. We are scattered. And in addition to that, although the working class exists objectively, in that there are people going out there and doing all of the work and all of the production, it does not exist subjectively. So we don't exist in our own minds as a class of people. We are, in our minds, we are part of the ruling class. We are just a different section of it. We don't identify ourselves as working class, so we've been stripped of that identity. I will say that in terms of the working class, right now, even at its lowest point in about 50 years, the organized labor movement, Colorado AFL-CIO represents over 50,000 workers. If they strike, the economy of Colorado comes to a halt. It doesn't have to be even every other worker in Colorado. If the union workers struck on Monday morning, Colorado would come to a halt. There would not be a bullet necessary to be fired. We wouldn't even have to leave our homes. And this is exactly why the concept of a general strike is totally foreign to all of us here today. It is not a strategy that we are told to work toward, and the first time you mention it in any union hall, your own union leaders will work to stop you to actually conduct it. So finally, I kind of want to wrap up with the Green Party. I've not been a lifelong member of the Green Party. I've been lukewarm about it, I guess, although I am in it now. The question is can the Green Party build into a mass party? I would say that there's some weaknesses that prohibit or interfere with that. I think that the Green Party traditionally views elections like we get our people elected and then they go into office and they make change. It is not expressly a party of the 99%. That it does not employ direct action, although I think that's changing. The greater the anger and the impatience becomes, I think that's changing. And that the old wing of the Green Party can tend to see itself as the Democratic Party light, in that it sees itself as the loyal opposition to the Democratic Party. It is always looking to the Democratic Party to pull out its new rank and file members, and also ultimately, in the most traditional sense, as a means to exert pressure on the Democratic Party rather than to build a genuine alternative. There are some advantages to the Green Party, which I have really tried to promote. It's a neutral ground for the left. In other words, there is no left group, there is no socialist group that owns it. And in that sense, it pulls the socialist groups in where they have a neutral playing field. And because of that lack of ownership of the Green Party, they tend to play better. Those groups that are willing to actually get involved in that. In addition to that, I think it's evolving. I think the Green Party is not the same thing that it was even a year ago. Just this summer, the Green Party campaigned, or elements within the Green Party campaigned for a platform amendment that was expressly anti-capitalist, which I thought was a little much at first, but that amendment actually passed by over 77% of the vote. Technically, the Green Party right now is the largest anti-capitalist party in the country. In addition, sometimes, despite our best effort, it finds itself in a historically strategic position. There are no viable alternatives to the Green Party right now. You will see individuals running on their various parties, but the Green Party right now is the only party with national scope where people could potentially pour into if and when they leave the two major capitalist parties. In addition to this, social conflict is escalating. This conflict needs a place to live, and the events are accelerating. I think Black Lives Matter was really the explosion that most clearly embodies those things. When I was in Chicago just this last Thanksgiving, Black Lives Matter had shut down the entire loop, and their chant wasn't no justice, no peace. It was actually no justice, no profits. It was not an appeal to the Mercantile Exchange or the Board of Trade. They went in there and disrupted it and shut it down. And in the months that followed, Chicago teachers went on strike. They occupied the Chicago Board of Trade and were arrested. People started to blockade highways, as they've done all over the country. The last one I saw in Chicago that was a blockade of the Dan Ryan Highway, which I've always used as a barometer to what I thought revolution would look like. It wasn't actually even Black Lives Matter. Everybody out there was black. But actually it was the Chicago State University teachers that were protesting against cuts to Chicago State University, which is a very working class and very African American population. So what you see is the contagious nature of direct action spreading from the Black Lives Matter movement to teachers and to other elements of society, and that is starting to impact the Green Party. I want to wrap up here, and I'm not going to read, this is a really good book. It's History of the Russian Revolution by Trotsky.
Light reading.
It's light reading. I know that, what's-his-face, Churchill once described it. He said that never has evil been so brilliantly portrayed. So that should be encouraging.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, I'm not going to start at the beginning, but I want to talk, and it's unfortunate that I have to do this from 100 years ago. But this is a short conversation between two major generals in the Russian army, the Tsar army, about the conditions of what was going on in Petrograd. Ivanov and Kabalov. Okay, so there's a conversation. This is what are those called? The telegraph, right? Oh, is that what they do? That? All right. And so Ivanov is returning to Petrograd, and he wants to know what the hell he's getting into here. And he says, how many troops are in order and how many have been misbehaving? Kabalov replies, I have at my disposal in the Admiralty building 4 companies of the Guard, 5 squadrons of cavalry and Cossacks, and 2 batteries. The rest of the troops have gone over to the revolutionists, or by agreement with them are remaining neutral. Soldiers are wandering through the town singly or in bands, disarming officers. Which railroad stations are guarded? All of the stations are in the hands of the revolutionists and strictly guarded by them. In what parts of the city is order preserved? The whole city is in the hands of the revolutionists. The telephone is not working. There is no communication between different parts of the city. What authorities are governing different parts of the city? I can't answer this question. Are the ministries functioning properly? The ministries have been arrested. The ministers have all been arrested by the revolutionists. What police forces are at your disposal at the present moment? None whatsoever. What technical supply and institutions of the War Department are now in your control? I have none. What quantity of provisions is at your disposal? There are no provisions at my disposal. In the city on February 5th, there were 5.6 million pounds of flour in store. 5.6 million pounds of flour had been redistributed. How many weapons, artillery, and military stores fallen into the hands of the mutineers? All of the artillery establishments are in the hands of the revolutionists. Quite simply, what military forces and staffs are in your control? The chief of the staff of the district is in my personal control. With the other district administrators, I have no connections.
All 2 of them are left.
Booyah. I should point out that that revolution took place about 12 years after a march on the Tsar's Palace of Workers that used as their lead banners a gigantic picture of the Tsar himself, of course, to ingratiate themselves to the Tsar. And their other picture was of like some big Catholic patron saint. Those were who they identified as leaders. The leaders of that march actually asked all the Marxists to go to the back of the march. And actually, when the Tsar opened fire and killed over 1,000 people, that is why the Marxists survived that day. Within 15 years, the entire royal family was dead. That's how fast this stuff can actually take place. So I'm just going to conclude it there. I'm used to this term that it won't happen in our lifetime. I've heard that very many times. These are great ideas, but they won't happen in our lifetime. I just want to point out that now that I'm in the environmental movement, from the labor movement, that I've learned that 50% of natural life has been lost between 1970 and 2010. 50% of natural life has been lost in 40 years. So there are no other lifetimes. Something has to be built. The whole world and our future is reliant upon this. So no pressure. And thank you.
So, because of the amount of people here, when we open up a discussion, we usually like to go on a stack system. If you have something to say, a comment, question, etc., you wouldn't mind trying to get my attention, I'll put you on, just like Scott did. He raised his hand. I got